It's been an inconsistent season for the Saints, but a win over the 49ers would give them some life going into the later portion of the season. Would they be able to pull off the upset, though? We'll talk about it right here on the Straight Up Saints podcast.
You're listening to the Straight Up Saints podcast.
Joining me for this edition of the Straight Up Saints podcast presented by DraftKings Sportsbook is Jason Aponte. He covers the 49ers. You can check out his work on YouTube. He does the Sprint Right Option podcast as well. A lot of great content going on. Jason, what's going on, man? Thank you for joining the show.
Chris, appreciate you asking me on, man. It's good that we were just talking about it, fellow East Coasters who cover warm weather teams, freezing together and coming together. I like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned it. You're from the East Coast. I'm from the East Coast. We're both New York guys. Before we get into 49ers, San Francisco related, Aaron Judge, free agent. We're both Yankees fans. I know some people don't like to hear it because of the hate that they get, but what's kind of your gut feeling on this situation? Because I know some people are panicking after his recent visit to see the Giants.
See, that's the thing is I'm not as panicked. I always would have thought that he was going to test and see what was out there. Like, why wouldn't you? And that doesn't necessarily swing me one way or the other. I mean, if you had to ask me right now, my gut is the Yankees are going to outbid anybody, give him whatever it is that he wants. And I think the contention with a lot of people is going to be, well, this is such a Yankee move to sign a 30-year-old for 9 years. Like, we've seen this play out over and over. That feels like the Yankee thing to do. So I think that it inevitably is what gets it done, as other teams will balk at giving him 7 and 8 and 9 years, knowing that he's already 30. But if they lose Aaron Judge, they're going to lose a very, very big part of Yankee fans in terms of the way they've been dealing with things, because Hal is not like George. So you know that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I always tell this with my friends who are also Yankees fans. I'm like, what an offseason it would be if they end up losing Judge, and then the one guy Yankees fans want gone and Josh Donaldson is still there playing on opening day. It would just be a complete 180. And then I think you'll finally see some things change. You'll see more pressure on the front office. Not that I want that. I'd like to see Judge in a Yankee uniform for life, but we'll see what happens, especially when things aren't going well for the Saints. I can look at the flip side. Things are going a little bit better for the Niners. They seem to be figuring it out. And before we kind of get into that, speaking of Niners Saints, some of the best games over the last decade have been between these two teams. A little bit over a decade now, thinking back to the 2011 playoff game in the divisional round. I remember where I was for that game. A lot of people know, I mentioned on the podcast occasionally, but I'm not sure if you're aware of this, so I'll tell you. I actually I grew up with 49ers fans. My dad grew up a 49ers fan watching Joe Montana, so my older brother ended up being one. So I, by default, am kind of subjected to whatever's going on with the Niners. So I'm watching every game when I can. I'm checking everything out, and I had a basketball game earlier that day. I get home for the game, and I'm watching it. Second half, see Alex Smith just take over. I'm ready to sob. I mean, this was like 12 years ago. I'm in my feelings. On the flip side, how does it feel when you guys win one of those big games? Because you're on the great side of that.
Well, I mean, that is just always going to be one of the great games. And it felt like a turning point for the 49ers in terms of where they were going. And I think that's how I viewed it more than anything. It's like, okay, they've had this great season, but they need to start winning playoff games, especially against – I think a lot of people forget the juggernaut offense that the Saints were. A lot of 49er fans like to throw at me, well, they weren't as good on grass. And I'm like, they scored 36 points in this game. I was like, I think they were fine, and I remember in that season, I believe you scored over 43 times and 60 in a game. Like, that's how well that offense was. So you think about how that game started going, the Saints weren't really getting it going, and then boom, all of a sudden they flip a switch, and Jimmy Graham is down the field touchdown. Darren Sproles is down the field touchdown, back and forth. You never really thought that Alex Smith was going to be able to keep up in that sort of game. Obviously it feels better to talk about it because of the way that it came out, but that always felt like a game for me. Like, I need to see them win one of these games before I really, really get excited about this team. No doubt it came against an offensive juggernaut, and that's always what I'm going to remember about that.
Yeah, that was one of those rare playoff games where almost every big player stepped up. You mentioned Jimmy Graham, Darren Sproles, obviously Vernon Davis on the receiving end of the big touchdown there. Before I get into this game coming up this Sunday, the matchups, what's going to be key, I talk about it at work with my employees about if you had to build a roster, 53-man roster of the same guy, who's it going to be? And we're going through it. Some people bring up Micah Parsons. Some people bring up Deebo Samuel. And I bring up Taysom Hill. So I'm going to ask you, if you had to pick, would you rather have a 53-man roster constructed of just Taysom Hill or Deebo Samuel? I think it's a fair one. They're both two of the best athletes in the game.
See, I mean, Deebo threw a touchdown last year, so we're getting closer to at least having that in the discussion. I think that the Taysom Hill stuff is very much overblown, especially when you look at the impact that he has. Like, everyone always talks about, well, he's back there to tell he's running, and yet you still can't stop it, right? Like, so it's a funny discussion. I actually like that you brought this up off the cuff. I think it would probably be Taysom Hill. Like, jack of all trades, master of none, really, but somebody that can always get it done. And I think that for Debo, obviously, he needs someone to throw him the ball, right? Or, and obviously you can hand it off and things like that. A lot of what he does and makes him special is Kyle Shanahan being able to dial it up. And you saw it against Arizona, in which they run a play where it gives tells for every single linebacker and defender that it's going one way, and those guys just turn the other way, and they flip that thing to Debo Samuel. So a lot of his success has to do with the fact that it's kind of a marriage between Debo and Kyle Shanahan. Feels like Taysom Hill can do anything in anybody's scheme just because he's so talented in each facet of the game.
That makes me very happy to hear, because there's a lot of people out here who are still not in on the Taysom Hill thing. I'm like, you got to stop looking at it as a quarterback. Just think of it as a football player. It makes the experience a lot more enjoyable. So talking about this game, and I think one thing that I find really interesting, when Christian McCaffrey gets traded, the first reaction for Saints fans is great. Don't have to play him that second time when you meet the Panthers. Well, now you do. He's just going to be in a 49ers uniform, which makes it, I think, a hell of a lot more dangerous. When that move happened, I had two thoughts. It was one where, man, McCaffrey's so special. I think he's arguably the best running back, and him and Shanahan's system, God knows how that's going to play out. The other one is, well, Shanahan can kind of turn water into wine with running backs, and we've seen it just kind of going through the years, what he's been able to do. It's played out so well, obviously, going through the last couple of games. Even last week, against the Cardinals, everyone talks about the Kittle touchdown. I know Ayuk had 2 touchdowns, but man, CMC, every time he got the ball, did something with it. What was your initial reaction to the move as opposed to now? Is it kind of par for the course? You kind of expected this? What's kind of been your reaction with the way the Niners have used him relative to what you thought would happen when they got him?
Well, when we first acquired him, I was ecstatic. And for many of those reasons that you talked about. Look, Kyle Shanahan has turned water to wine when it comes to running backs, right? Jeff Wilson, who is over now in the same system, he's going to take over where Raheem Mostert. We have guys like that. Matt Breida even had some success here. But they're still not as special. And that's not disrespecting them in any way, right? Like Christian McCaffrey, and you hear Jimmy Garoppolo talking about he sees the field like a quarterback. Well, now his addition now has made things easier for Jimmy Garoppolo, because now you look 1, 2, 3, that's all covered. Well, you can dump it off to a guy now that can make guys miss and everything as well. So my initial reaction was 2 things. One, you finally got an electric running back, somebody who can take this scheme to the next level. And also, it's all in. The 49ers are all in. I think they understood what was right in front of them. And for as much as 49er fans hate this to say this, the Rams all-in approach brought them a Super Bowl. And again, it may not have long-term success, and you're looking at the effects of it right now with all the injuries. Guys are going to leave. You can't pay everybody. But you got to win a Super Bowl first before you can have those discussions. So I like the idea of this happening. Also happens to be the fact that the Rams were in on them, and I doubt that the 49ers were going to allow that to happen again. But I think everything that's going on right now with McCaffrey and the way they're using him is perfect. When you look at all the playmakers now, he doesn't have to be the guy that he was in Carolina, 30 times touching the ball, which can lead to injuries, right? And Elijah Mitchell's back. So now you can use him sparingly. His touches become more efficient. And I think Kyle Shanahan is just kind of scratching the surface with what he can do with all of these guys. And you kind of saw it come a little bit to fruition on Monday night in Mexico City.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the Rams. That's why, it's been such a struggling year for the Saints fans to kind of go through it, is where they kind of went all in with their moves, whether or not it's right or wrong. Obviously, time tells us, and so far this season, it's kind of been the wrong move. But I've always agreed kind of what you said, right? If you feel like you have a chance to go for it, you should go for it. And the one thing when I look at this NFC, I say the Saints got right was, well, the NFC is for the taking. They're just not good enough to actually end up taking it. On the flip side, for the 49ers, you talked about them being all in this year. When they have games like they did against the Cardinals, and I'd say, honestly, the second half adjustments they've made, specifically on defense, it just seems like D'Amico in the second half, the last 3 games, they've just turned it up to a different level. The Rams game, obviously, they played great. Chargers game really just evolved there, and the Cardinals one was just, dominant start to finish. When you look at this team, how confident do you feel that they are the team to beat in the NFC, despite not having the best record?
I think right now they're trending in that direction. I think it would be kind of foolish right now to just say that they're the outright team to beat. I mean, you look at what happened with Dallas in that first half. Okay, they look a little wishy-washy, but then they dominate in the second half as well, too. Philadelphia isn't going anywhere. Jordan Davis is certainly going to return. So they're still there. They look like the team, though. They don't have to be the best team or the team in that way. They look like the team that nobody wants to play because their style of football travels, the defense, the running game, all of those things. That Jimmy Garoppolo can keep the ball out of harm's way and make enough plays. They become that team that is the team that you don't want to face. There's always one of those in the NFC. I would prefer to be that team than the team that's the overall number 1 seed who's been running through everybody. Again, at the end of the year, when you get to week 18, you reevaluate all these teams, you reevaluate their health, how they're playing, all of those things. That's when you start to really understand what teams are. But as of right now, they're trending in the right direction. I think that because of the experience that Kyle Shanahan has brought to this team, I mean, last year they started off so poorly, righted the ship, got within moments of the Super Bowl, made a Super Bowl in 2019. They're all bought in. The culture's there. They know the formula. They know how to do it. I think that is a little bit more of the telling sign than like the Eagles, who are in their first year of getting through it and figuring it out. They're a very dangerous team as well. But I think as of right now, they're trending in the right direction. I just hesitate a little bit to just say all in, okay, this is the team to beat, just because there's so much more football to be played and so many variables before we can understand what teams are.
Yeah, and I could totally respect that answer. That's a good answer right there. And you talked about Jimmy Garoppolo. There's like some middle ground somewhere, right? Because when Jimmy Garoppolo plays bad, I'll even go on Twitter and mention, some throw. Like, I'll bring up the Chiefs game, right? Mm-hmm. Towards the end of the first half, that interception just can't happen. Should be getting points there. They don't get any. And then on the, looking on the other side, the last 3 games, turnover free. The Chargers game, he had a great throw on the run to Ray McCloud, I think. And then this past week against the Cardinals, had that playoff script kind of to George Kittle that ended up being a touchdown. I don't think he's found something here that's going to, the light clicked and now he's taking his game to another level. But what I'll say about Jimmy G is when he manages the game well, that's when the Niners are at their best. And I feel like it's been that way. For you, though, does that confidence level change going into the playoffs? Or you're like, no, I'm still kind of worried about Jimmy G when the lights come on in that stage? Because we mentioned the defense. I know they're going to step up. You mentioned the run game. They'll be there. And I think for, let's say, a game like the Saints, which might end up being a trap game, Jimmy's got to take care of the football. Where's the confidence level in him at? Has this 3-game stretch kind of changed it?
I think that's kind of the overall discussion right now on 49ers Twitter and amongst 49ers fans is we've seen this before where Jimmy has these large stretches. I wrote an article on Niners Nation today that should be out in some time. I evaluated 5 game stretches from his best seasons, 2017 at the end of the year when they ripped off 5 in a row, 2019, which include the shootout against the New Orleans Saints, one of the best games I've ever witnessed, and this 5-game stretch that we have right here. All the numbers are strikingly similar. What I will say is this, is what Jimmy Garoppolo is doing right now is not lifting his game to another level. He's just executing it better than he ever has, meaning he's not having the no throws anymore. Like, you usually would get 1 or 2 of those throws from Jimmy Garoppolo. Like, God, what are you looking at? Now those are gone right now. Like right now, he seems to be playing confident. He seems to be playing more free. A lot of that has to do with the offensive line finally gelling. And people forget that that's a big part of how quarterbacks are successful. And that's any quarterback, from Mahomes to everybody. You do need a good offensive line. But I do think the Christian McCaffrey thing is really important now because of him, the reality of like, I know I can get the ball to him and he can make something happen. I don't have to force the issue. What you're watching is Jimmy Garoppolo not putting the ball in harm's way. He hasn't changed his game. He's just executing it at a better level without the turnover-worthy throws, and he's sprinkling in these other throws. So I don't know how much of this has to do with the fact that he's in a career year, that nobody's hearkening for Brock Purdy to play, because I know I don't want to see him play, as opposed to last year with Trey Lance, right? Everybody kind of wanted to see Trey play. You at least could have that discussion. I think Jimmy's playing free and clear, knowing that there's nobody behind me, and I know I am playing for my NFL livelihood here in a career year, plus being surrounded by all these weapons. I think all of it is a perfect storm for how he's been playing. But I don't think he's changed his game. I just think he's executing at a better level than he has in many years.
Yeah, and before we switch gears here on the Garoppolo topic, and I bring it up because it's kind of twofold, right? One thing, the Niners have to figure out the quarterback situation past this year, but also I'm just looking for the Saints' perspective. Their quarterback situation obviously is not great at all right now with the whole revolving between Andy Dalton and Jameis Winston. Are you under the assumption like this is it, right? You'd imagine Trey's the starter next year, Jimmy's going elsewhere. If so, what do you kind of think are some good landing spots? Or do you think the door is open? I'm curious your perspective on this.
Chris, I learned this past offseason to not predict anything when it comes to the 49ers. And if the 49ers make a deep playoff run and they turn back to Jimmy Garoppolo and they say, we can't let you go, wouldn't shock me. They turn right back around and to Trey Lance, wouldn't shock me. I'm not going to take a hard stance just because I took such a hard stance last offseason. How can you bring back Jimmy Garoppolo? You got to let the kid play. Well, thank God that they did, because otherwise we'd have been stuck with Nate Sudfeld or Brock Purdy, and the season would have been over when Trey Lance went down. So, again, I think what I've learned this offseason is to expect the unexpected with this team. Trading for Christian McCaffrey's out of their ordinary, doing things like bringing Jimmy Garoppolo back after they had him at training camp, which we were at, and he wasn't there any of the days, didn't have a playbook, and they're just like, please just come back for a backup money, and then him turning into a guy who still has his team in this contention. I have no grasp on what they're about to do, and I wouldn't be shocked one way or another. If the 49ers were somehow to find a way to win the Super Bowl, I don't know how you turn away from a quarterback that was able to execute that, given what you've given up for Trey Lance. So it's going to be another interesting offseason because we're going to have these same questions. We have all the same questions about Trey Lance just because he hasn't had experience, and this team will still largely be in a win now mode. So again, we're gonna do the same song and dance all offseason. So I'm gonna stay away from a strong prediction here.
That's totally fine with me. And I'll say, if anything, that's good news for you, though. More content opportunities there. You have a lot of talked about whether it's good or bad. And it's funny, you mentioned that reaction. My older brother throughout the offseason was like, no way he's coming back, no way. And then to your point, it's like Trey goes down. And that actually, my brother flew to that game to go watch the Seattle one when he gets hurt. So then I get a text, well, thank God we didn't get rid of him. I'm like, okay. I was like, so game on here. So let's look at this Saints game. I think you look at the spread, obviously, I think it opened at like 9.5, something pretty large. And it makes sense, right? Niners are coming off a dominant win against the Cardinals. Saints, I know they just beat the Rams, but obviously you can attest to this. This is a bad year for the Rams. This is a kind of a throwaway year, which as a fan, I would say if my team wins a Super Bowl the next year, if it's a throwaway, I can't give two shits. I honestly just can't. But do you feel like this is a prime trap game, or do you think with the Niners so much to play for, right? Still the same record as Seattle, even though they do have the tiebreaker. NFC's kind of crowded right now. Do you feel like you know this team better than I would? Do you feel like this is one where they could fall into that trap or no?
I mean, that could always happen. I just don't think it will. I just think that the focus with this team, and largely, sometimes they come out a little flat. I'll say that. They come out a little flat, but they don't play 60 minutes of football like that. You mentioned the second half adjustments, the way D'Amico is. It almost feels like D'Amico and Kyle are kind of polar opposites in terms of how they do adjustments, right? Kyle's so good with the scripted stuff. Okay, well, when the scripted stuff isn't working and you get away from that, then 49er fans' anxiety starts to build. And it's almost like D'Amico lets the first drive go by and say, okay, you're doing this, this, and this. All right, well, here's my adjustments. And it kind of flips like one way. One guy's waiting for information. One guy kind of has information and then is going to use that to build upon later on. I think that there's times where the 49ers come out flat. They come out and they start slow. Look at the Chargers game. The Rams didn't come out like that. The Rams had two very long drives to start the game. I think that the 49ers will eventually find their way. I don't think that this game is going to be something like where the 49ers run away with it. I just don't think that they're going to fall into a trap game, but they do have a tendency to come out a bit flat in certain aspects, but I just don't think that they'll fall into a 60-minute trap. This team feels very focused right now, healthy, very happy. They there's a different vibe going on with them right now, but anything can happen in the NFL, and that's why the Saints get paid too.
So the one thing the Niners do, I would say more than most teams, kind of throwing inside the numbers, and that's probably a Jimmy Garoppolo thing, and also a lot of like slant routes and things of those nature. Saints are pretty banged up at linebacker. I mean, they've been still getting good production out of Demario Davis, but no Pete Werner. Obviously, George Kittle looked like he was coming into his own again, which is a great sight to see. McCaffrey, I know his history against the Saints and what he's been able to do. Is that where you think a game like this kind of falls on the shoulders of those two, or you still think kind of a mixture? Because on Monday night, I would say all the weapons kind of kept making those full house references with those weird graphics on ESPN, but they kept talking about the full house of weapons they have. If you kind of had to pinpoint at a game like this, and we could go to the Saints history of which was the 2020 season, 2019 season with the shootout. A lot of Kittle there. Obviously, had the big play towards the end of the game to seal the deal. Do you kind of feel like that's where the game will run through primarily between those two? Or do you feel like if Debo plays, which I kind of imagine he would, I know he's questionable, but he was limited throughout the week, where do you kind of think it goes through for who kind of gets to be the X factor offensively this week?
I think that's the fun part is there's no way to pinpoint it. I think you could have seen the Kittle thing happening because it was a bit of a squeaky wheel game. He was asked all week about having 2 targets, and he said, sure, I'd love to have a little bit more. We also have to point out the fact that the Arizona Cardinals absolutely mailed in that game at the end. They didn't want to tackle. They didn't want to play. So, yes, things were going well, but when they started getting, blown out a bit, they kind of just gave up. With this game, I know Marcus Lattimore is back to return. That's a good sign for you guys, right? He had a kidney laceration or something like that.
It's one of those injuries I see, and I'm like, this is why I never complain when guys get hurt. If I have a kidney laceration, just put me to bed. I'm done.
Right, exactly. So he's coming back. Cam Jordan missed his first game, I think, ever. I think he's probably going to play in this game. I think it's still going to lean on the run game. And I think that that's always, it's an evergreen statement. I think it would be against any opponent that you would feel this, but with the amount of rushing yards and yards per play that you guys have been giving up, it feels like there's a chance for the 49ers to continue to do that. Jimmy's going to have to make those timely throws. I don't think they ever really want to put it in Jimmy Garoppolo's hands, no matter how well he's playing. I just don't think that's a recipe for success for them. If you guys find a way to slow down the run, some of those penny fronts, maybe you're getting in those gaps and you're not allowing the motion to move you guys out of the way, then you got to get the ball in Jimmy's hands. That's where it can kind of turn. But there's no real way to pinpoint like, hey, it's going to be Kittle, it's going to be Debo. I think whatever the defense is going to give the 49ers is what they're going to take. But I always think that it's always going to come back to the run game, especially when you kind of look at, where I believe the Saints are 23rd in rushing yards allowed per game. So that's like not at the bottom, but it's not, somewhere where the 49ers can't exploit that if they didn't want to.
Yeah, that's actually been one of the big issues Saints fans have complained about this year. Over the last 5 years, they've been one of the best run defense. That's not the case this year. Najee Harris and the Steelers had over 200 rushing yards, and they do not have a good ground attack this year. So I definitely agree. That's something that I'm going to look at for this one, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's both McCaffrey and Mitchell that end up having the big games. Looking from the Saints offense versus the Niners defense, the one thing I'm concerned about for starters is when the Saints have their worst games of the year, and I mean, they've had 7 losses already, so there's been a lot of them. It's been giving up on giving up blitz situations where the protection's not great. And I think that's something that Fred Warner does so well, probably better than most linebackers, although he does everything so exceptionally well. If there's one area where I think they could maybe get something going, obviously seems like an easy statement here, but Chris Olave has been fantastic. And look, the only thing the Cardinals did well on Monday night was Hopkins got the ball a lot, although I know that led to kind of steroid boy comments and whatever the hell happened after that. Mm-hmm. But do you feel like that's kind of like probably the best bet for the Saints in terms of moving the ball? That's where I'm at in terms of, rankings among rookies. Olave's up everywhere. First in 15-yard receptions, 20-yard receptions, yards, all that. Looking at this Niners secondary, particularly at the cornerback, I know Mosley's out for the year. Do you feel like that's probably the weak spot of that unit?
For sure, and especially if it goes to nickel. I love Jimmy Ward, but he's playing out of position right now. And if you line up Olave on Jimmy Ward, that's not going to be fun at all for Jimmy Ward. Credit Jimmy Ward for doing what the team is asking him to do and what's best. But he's much better suited as the free safety and coming down and covering tight ends here and there. They don't have a true nickel corner. And if you start moving Olave around, you put him in the slot, that's going to get dangerous. I think another thing that you can take advantage of, and we've seen teams do this to the 49ers, is a screen game. You get Alvin Kamara involved. You allow those pass rushes to get him because they are so aggressive. Sometimes Nick Bosa's over-aggressiveness bites him. And the Kansas City Chiefs were the first ones that really exploited that. And I think it's been put on tape. You got Jerick McKinnon on 3rd and 30 or something like that, catching a screen and getting through everybody for a first down. It was like backbreaking. And it's because guys are just getting upfield and they're not remembering their assignments. And who's better than catching the ball out of the backfield than Alvin Kamara? I mean, you could make the argument for McCaffrey, but man, getting Kamara back involved would ease that pass rush back off and make it a little bit easier for Andy Dalton. But for sure, Olave against whoever is going to be there in the slot, whether they move Samuel Womack back. I mean, Lenore's been fine, but if it's Jimmy Ward constantly, there are slot cornerbacks who are primarily slot cornerbacks that have problems covering Chris Olave. Obviously, he's number 1 ranked in everything for rookie receivers. Can't imagine what that would be like for Jimmy Ward. That could be something that I would look to as like, oh no, you could almost spam that to a point where it can lead to offensive success.
That's interesting. So maybe we'll see a lot of Ward and Jarvis Landry kind of going at each other. Although, no disrespect to Jarvis, Olave's kind of got that game-breaking speed. Jarvis, different speed at this point in his career. The front 7 of opposing defenses has been sometimes an issue for the Saints. I look at the Monday night game against the Ravens. I mean, Justin Houston's had a great year, but he completely turned back the clock in that one. Roquan Smith was just about 4 days acclimated to their system. He had a couple big moments there. Obviously, looking at this Niners front 7, I know Armstead's still banged up, but that's still a pretty nasty unit. And we've seen, there were points in the Monday night game where I genuinely felt bad for Colt McCoy because he was just taking tough hit after tough hit. Do you feel like this is a game where the pressure is just going to be ramped up from DeMeco? Because you talked about he sees that first drive, then he kind of makes his adjustments. No disrespect to Andy Dalton, but he's not the most mobile quarterback in the world, and he has struggled at times facing the blitz. And again, I brought up the Monday night game. I thought there were moments where he got kind of happy feet because he was trying to get out when there was no pressure to be found on some plays. You just get hit enough times that you get a little rattled. Do you feel like DeMeco's probably going to turn up the heat against an immobile quarterback? Because no Kyler, Colt was in, and boy, they turned it up against him.
I think it depends if Samson Ebukam plays in this game. He's such a guy that nobody really talks about at this point. I think when DeMeco realizes that he can't get there with 4 is when he's going to go ahead and start dialing it up, and he's been very good at that. I think he's done that much more than Robert Saleh has, and that's why I prefer him in terms of that discussion of like, well, who was the better defensive coordinator when they were here? I think DeMeco has such a good feel of calling those things. So it's all going to boil down to the situation. If you guys get yourself in down and distance when you're like 3rd and obvious passing, you're probably going to get some extra heat. The only issue that I would have with it is you can't leave those guys on the back end with Olave. Like, you have to be able to, like, no disrespect, like, Talanoa Hufunga's been great, but he's been missing a lot of tackles. He, at times can get caught out of position, as you saw with the first touchdown against the Chargers. So there's still that hesitance there. Like, Mooney Ward's going to be on one side of the field. He doesn't travel. So everywhere else kind of feels like it can be beaten, even if Deshaun Gibson's been good. I love Jimmy Ward. Hufanga's been great. Lenore's been fine. But, Olave, and if you're allowing him to sit back there and he doesn't get pressure with 4 and you have to bring another linebacker, then, Juwan Johnson's somebody who I've been looking at for you guys. He's been making a difference and he's been getting the ball a lot. I know that Ravens game was a bit of it was out of hand when he was capped. I think he has touchdowns in the last 5. So how do you offset that? Are you going to bring somebody down and cover him as well too? So for as much as everybody talks about, the Saints don't really have weapons, I think you guys do. And it's just a matter of situation in which how D'Amico is going to be able to dial up those blitzes. I don't think he's just going to come right out doing it. But if he notices he's not getting there with 4, and if Ebukam is playing, he might be able to get there with 4 easier. But if he's not and he notices he needs to, then he will. But I don't think he'll start out that way.
Yeah, no, and to your point, I don't look at the Saints offense and be like, man, there's no weapons. It's just, look, O-line's pretty banged up for the last couple of weeks. They've been without 3 starters. And then we talked about the quarterback spot. It's tough to win when you're turning over the ball at a high clip from that spot. So going into this one, in terms of key matchup and also just lean, what's kind of something you're looking at for this one that you think could really swing the game in either favor? And just ultimately, how are you feeling going into this one?
I'm feeling overall well, but it's just that the screen, I keep bringing it up, the screen game, right? I do think that it's been out there and it's a little bit of the worst kept secret about the 49ers. Yeah, you got guys, you want to get down the field, you want to get up the field against the quarterback. But man, if you start letting Alvin Kamara just it always seems like he's gliding, like he's never even really moving his legs or anything like that. If you start to get him out in the field, he starts ripping off, chunk plays and keeping things going on 3rd down. That's where the 49ers have, for some people to not notice this, it hasn't happened the last few weeks, but they had problems getting off the field on 3rd down. You're not getting off the field on 3rd down, especially with that weapon that is Alvin Kamara. I get a little bit nervous about that, and I do think that the Saints are going to try to go to that just to slow down the pass rush and also get chunk yardage, and I think that's one of the ways that you will.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I look at this game, a lot of people are going to talk about, hey, can they pull off the upset? Can they not? I've had a very weird kind of, I'm not going to say epiphany, but the way I've watched this season unfold for the Saints, 2 weeks ago, they lose to the Steelers. I thought that was a terrible loss. I got on here talking about how I want the coaching staff to kind of just be relieved of their duties and putting it in a nice way. And after they beat the Rams, I said, look, if they come out and they beat the Niners, great, but they haven't won back-to-back games at all this year. And the more telling fact was Dennis Allen once in his head coaching career has won back-to-back games, which I think is kind of alarming. And then the second thing I thought was, well, if they lose to the 49ers, find me a team that's kind of peaking better than them right now if they go on to win 4 games. So it doesn't really change my opinion regardless. Either way, I'm kind of under the same thing right now. I don't think it's going to be just a rout. I look at the way the Saints have played this year, whether it's garbage time or not, the scores look closer than they are. You mentioned Juwan Johnson. He kind of has shined in 4th quarters when teams are kind of playing prevent, and hey, to each their own, you got to go get your production out there. So I'm expecting the 49ers to win, but if the Saints come out early, keep things close, to your point, if the Niners come out flat, who knows, maybe hang around. But the second half adjustment thing for me has kind of been where I'm looking at this Niners team and I'm like, if D'Amico gets things going, if Justin Herbert struggled against them, if Stafford struggled against them, is Andy Dalton going to be the guy to crack the second half Niners defense that's been great? I don't know. I'm a little down there. So before I let you go, I have some things I want to talk about with you. Before everyone started panicking about Twitter going out, you start throwing out unpopular opinions, takes, whatever. I'm cracking up because I'm actually about to go watch a movie, and I think I forgot what it was. I think it was The Menu I went to go see last week. So I'm sitting there going to watch that, and I see you're firing off takes. I'm just cracking up. I'm like, this is hilarious, man. So I got to ask you. I see you got the Batman thing behind you. You got a bunch of Funko Pops. I got a ton of them everywhere. It's ridiculous. What's kind of a couple of your unpopular opinions that you're willing to share with people?
Yeah, so big Batman fan, and my unpopular opinion is that Ben Affleck's the best live action Batman. He's just been cast in the worst Batman movies. I mean, when you think about The Dark Knight Returns, and that it's literally ripped from the comic book and thrown on the screen. It's a jaded Batman. It's somebody who has seen loss. He's tired of being nice because he feels like he hasn't gotten anywhere. It's the perfect Batman in terms of comic, right? I think we can all agree Christian Bale is the best Batman in the best Batman movies. What I mean by that is Dark Knight is a Joker movie. Dark Knight Rises is a Bruce Wayne Bane movie, right? And I get it. Batman versus Superman is not a good movie. I'm not here to, and I don't want to talk about all the rest of that stuff after. I'm just talking about his singular performance, what he was supposed to represent. For me, it doesn't get any better than Ben Affleck's performance in that movie, unfortunately. that whole universe like went to hell. And I don't want to talk about Justice League, Zack Snyder's Justice League, all that stuff. But for me, Ben Affleck is the best live action Batman because he represents one of my favorite comics, and that's exactly what they were going for. And I don't think that there's ever been a more accurate comic depiction on the screen than Ben Affleck. Yeah, that's a very unpopular opinion. People don't like that one.
You know that I personally would have to see more to make that opinion, but I'll agree with something. I love the Christian Bale take. I tell people that all the time. I actually did love the new Batman. I thought Robert Pattinson was fantastic, but again, not enough Bruce Wayne in that. So that's why I hold my reservations. And I think Ben Affleck just looked like how Bruce Wayne looks in the comics, which was awesome. And here's where I'll sympathize with you on this. And it's kind of upsetting because the tables have completely turned. But I spent so many of my teen years sitting here, complaining that Andrew Garfield's the best Spider-Man. He just got screwed over by Sony. And I sat here and I complained because I was an Ultimate Spider-Man fan growing up. And I loved the suit with the big eyes. And they did that with his. And I just fell in love with that. Then No Way Home comes out and everyone and their mothers is like, oh, well, Andrew Garfield's amazing. I'm like, where the hell were you when this poor man got fired? So I'm with you on that. Although I think Ben's coming back for Aquaman. So at least you get some shine there or something rumored of that sort.
Yeah. I think he is. But as of right now, DC's just a mess, man. Especially after coming out of the movie theater to see Black Panther and what Marvel is about to build up to. Because I haven't been a big fan of their phase. This phase feels like it's just kind of middling and it's just kind of treading water. But what they're about to do is something that I'm super excited about. And just DC seems to just try to find their footing. Look, I agree with you. I think Robert Pattinson's, this is another unpopular opinion, Robert Pattinson's Batman movie is the best origin movie of all the Batman movies. That includes Batman Begins and Batman 89. I enjoyed that one. That's the first time we've been able to watch Batman be a detective and have a serial killer like on the loose. I think that's what I loved about that movie, and I love the tone. But yeah, DC's just kind of fumbling the bag right now. But you have to remember, even after Batman vs. Superman came out, it was supposed to be Ben Affleck writing, directing, and being in his own Batman movie where he was going to fight Deathstroke. And remember, Ben Affleck won an Oscar for Argo. He won an Oscar for Good Will Hunting. Like, the man has writing chops and he has directing chops. So it was going to be interesting to see that. But of course, that just goes away. So yeah, I mean, it feels like Ben Affleck's time is just one of the most, I guess, missed opportunities. It's so bittersweet. Like, I got to see one of the comics on the screen, but it just never materialized for, all those reasons.
I agree with that. I keep telling people I don't love Phase 4 and I keep getting hate for it, but I just didn't love it. And I actually told people I've had more fun watching DC products this year, even though DC's a mess, because I loved Peacemaker and I thought the Batman was the best movie of the year that I've seen. I'm going to see Knives Out later this weekend, so hopefully that changes things, but we'll see there. But anyway, Jason, before I let you go, man, let everyone know where they can check out your work. You mentioned an article coming out on Niners Nation and all that, so tell everyone where they can find your content.
Hey, Chris, thank you for reaching out, man. Big fan of yours. I really appreciate you, having me on just to talk ball, man. I'm a big fan of your content. I think you do things the right way, and I really appreciate the way that you cover the Saints. You're like one of the few Saints guys that I follow, and I always try to tap in whenever I can. I on Twitter at Jason Aponte 2103. Niners Nation almost every day throughout the week. You'll see something. Niners Nation Podcast Network, wherever you get your podcasts. I do a podcast on there, and my YouTube channel, Jason Aponte, where I do Sprint Right Option with Andrew Pasquini. But again, Chris, honored, humbled. Thank you so much for having me, man.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I knew I needed to have you on when something happened, and you put out a Happy Gilmore reference. Someone got suspended, and you put the suspended, kick him off the tour, and I'm like, oh, this is. I'm like, I love that, man.
That's how I've been able to like build up the few people that actually enjoy my content, man. It's more about like those movie tie-ins, all that stuff. Like, if I don't do it on Twitter, then I'm gonna annoy my wife with the comments. She's gonna be like, I don't even know what that's from, so I've got to give it to somebody.
No, the meme game is a 10 out of 10. I truly mean it. But anyway, Jason, I really appreciate you coming on, man. For everyone checking out, remember, not just for Saints, for Niners content. Well, I would imagine you'll have something up as soon as the game's over or shortly after. So stay tuned for that. And as always, guys, stay tuned for more content here on the Straight Up Saints podcast, the destination for